So I think at this point we'll have a chance to open up for discussion, for questions. Some of you may not have followed some of the developments today and may be surprised by some of the comments that were made here. And so maybe I'll just read the declaration that emerged out of the Ecumenical Patriarch today regarding the situation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And the declaration, which really came out maybe about 7 hours ago, maybe even less. Was it 4 hours ago? Less 4 hours ago? Okay.
Seems like 7 by now, yes.
I've been dreaming about this talk all night, so I didn't sleep all night. So maybe this was providential. So the official communique from His All Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch, the Holy Synod, and the Sacred Synod, and it declares the following matters as decreed. To renew the decision already made that the Ecumenical Patriarchate proceed to the granting of Autocephaly to the Church of Ukraine. Second, to reestablish the Stavropegion of the Ecumenical Patriarch in Kyiv. Third is to accept and review the petitions of appeals of Patriarch Filaret and Metropolitan Makari, which effectively canonically reinstated their hierarchical and priestly rank, and their faithful have been restored to communion with the Church. 4 is to revoke the legal binding of the synodal letter of the year 1686 by the Patriarchate of Moscow. And 5, the appeal to all sides all sides involved that they avoid appropriation of churches, monasteries, and other properties, as well as every other act of violence and retaliation, so that the peace and love of Christ may prevail. So this was the statement issued a couple hours ago by the Ecumenical Patriarchate at the end of their synaxis. So again, this is why this talk was so timely, and why many of us are revising our talks before we came here on the way to this round table. And so, what we'll do, I think, is just see if there are questions for our panelists or comments, and we'll just go around the table taking a person at a time. So, who would be courageous enough to be the first? We have a hand right here. Yes, please.
Thank you. I have one question for Very Reverend Bachula. And the issue is that you mentioned that it's at the majority of the people. Does this mean that every parish has to vote on this issue, and that the majority of the faithful have to ultimately agree to this?
When I say majority, I would prefer to say consensus.
Okay.
That would be 100%. But also we have to be quite cognizant of the fact that not all of the parishes, not all of the bishops and priests will go into the Autocephaly Church in Ukraine. Some of them will stay, as we know for sure, as one of the bishops actually mentioned here, stay. Some of the parishes, the bishop will stay with the Moscow Patriarchate, as so-called the only canonical church. But in case of parishes, for example, we have to remember right now there's a change of bylaws in Ukraine at this moment. That at this point that the parishes will own the properties. Not the bishop, not the priest, but the parishes. And if there's a majority in the parish that will vote to go to the Kyiv Patriarchate or the Autocephaly Church, they will do so. But once again, everything's based on the free will. That's one of the aspects I want to emphasize. Faith is based on the free will. I hope in Ukraine nobody will force anybody to move or to believe in something else. Faith has to be based on the free will. If the majority of the parish will love to go, I'm sure it's possible to do it.
But the free will is expressed through a vote, I take it.
Absolutely, yes.
So ultimately, is it not the case where certain parishes, and I may be repeating you, might still be under the Russian or the Moscow?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yes.
And is there not a lot of bribing and poking and stuff going on under the table here?
That's the reason why this last point on this communique is very important, to still preserve the peace. And also I want to emphasize, if I can do at this moment, I hope that the granting of Thomas to Ukraine at this moment won't be rushed. Just won't be rushed. Why? based on the historical facts, actually, the granting of autocephaly to Poland, to Polish Orthodox Church actually took place almost in the period of 3 years. Why? There are 4 points I want to emphasize why I hope they are not rushed. Number one, the presence of the exiles in Ukraine at this moment, there are 2 of them, and one is Metropolitan Orion. Number one, they have to make sure that really the church follows and is in the Orthodox faith. There are no any kind of wrong teachings whatsoever. I haven't heard. So that's number one. Number two, they have to make sure that all of the bishops had the right hierotonia, the ordinations. I hope that really all of the bishops at this moment of the Autocephaly Church and also Key Patriarchate, they have right ordinations. They have to check each one of them. It takes time. Number 3 is very important. Also, they have to realize that they have to unify the church in Ukraine. At this moment, we know that not all the church won't be unified completely, but as much as possible. And number 4, as was mentioned here as well, is very, very important. What will be the future structure of the Autocephaly Church in Ukraine? Is it going to be synodal, like for example, Russian Orthodox Church completely failed, that only bishops and 5 bishops or 7 bishops, they decide the affairs of the entire church? Or is it going to be more subordinate, where they include also the priests, some form of laity? There's going to be subordinate. That exactly has to be established before the Thomas is granted. That's the reason why I hope they will take some time to think about it. Thank you.
Okay, there's a question over here. Somebody had one? No? Right over. Excuse me, did you have a question? You had your hand up here. Was there?
No. I just wanted to say that the lady is there and nobody.
You guys have amazing
please.
timing. This is just coming to this talk. Question follows the earlier one about implementation mechanisms. I can speak as loud as I can, sorry about that. My question is really following the first one, implementation mechanisms. How is this actually going to be implemented if the likely opposition from the Moscow Patriarchate, who has the authority to decide who's going to join this church? How is the structure going to be created? What is that decision-making process looking like? The second question, what about the property issue? How is that going to be resolved? In the document, it says, let's not fight about the property, but that has to be resolved at some point. So how's that going to happen? And I have more, but I'll let others.
So the questions were about the implementation process of establishing a unified Ukrainian Orthodox Church given the various jurisdictions. And the other question had to do with simply some more worldly matters, such as the physical property of not just of parishes, but also of monasteries and other religious sites. So perhaps the panelists have...
Okay, well, by spending too much time on internet, I know that already Patriarch Philaret has said that this will be a meeting of bishops, of hierarchs will gather. So he has already made this announcement. Whether that will indeed be what happens as the steps we will see from depending on concept.
But bishops of, including the Moscow Patriarchate?
Yes, any bishop,
So
any bishop,
it's just
any bishop of the 3 jurisdictions would meet and decide this. Whether that will be or not, and as we can say, there are reasons for those who would argue it should not be. Remember as well the Stavropigion of Kiev. That is a very interesting point. It is there for a reason that Constantinople put in. That is, Stavropigia means a cross is placed and you are directly under the authority of the patriarch. Right? So this gives Constantinople a stronger standing in Ukraine than, or in this process than it would have otherwise. And then just on the property rights, I think, of course, the Patriarch Bartholomew very wisely put this in. But of course, he has no control over any of these events. They are decided by Ukrainian law and Ukrainian society and social context. And the Ukrainian law, as far as I understand, is not quite fully as clear because so many church properties have been given, as the Lavra have, in orenda. They have been rented out for 50 years. What are we going to do with the properties such as the Pochaio Lavra? And many parish buildings have already been signed on by Moscow patriarchal priests onto other entities as well. So I would expect there would be extremely long and legal difficulties. And then back to our 100th anniversary, and if Canadians give them any example, we know what happened throughout the 1920s and 30s throughout all of Western Canada, how long it took to work out those kind of processes. So I can't picture how it would not be difficult in Ukraine.
So just maybe as a footnote to the comment, number one, there has to be a sobor. Sobor, sobor. That's the gathering all of the bishops. Council. I'm sorry, council. That's right, council. No. Sobor of the bishops of all of the branches, 3 branches: Autocephaly, Kyiv Patriarchate, and also the Moscow Patriarchate.
Who organizes?
That is exarchs. We have 2 at this moment in Ukraine, exarchs who are organizing. At this point, based on what we know, there are already 10 Moscow Patriarchate bishops. They're willing to join the Sobor, the council, with 10. We don't know the names, but there were the 10.
We know 2 names, I take it, right?
3. Even
3 names we have. 3. Yeah.
Anyway, that will be number 1. Number 2.
10 out of how many?
90. Out of 90.
90.
Yeah.
So it's less than 10%.
But as
But the list is
ruling
already
bishops,
20.
they have ruling bishops and they have auxiliary bishops.
that's right.
I'm sorry.
But also an additional comment: as soon as the council is finished, there's going to be a process of implementations. Once again, it also involves another very serious matter, and I don't want to go deeper into this fact. For example, right now in the city of Lviv, there are 3 bishops, so-called Orthodox bishops. As you know, according to the ecclesiology of the Orthodox Church, in one city there can be only 1 Orthodox bishop. Now the question is, which one and where? So that's the reason why this Sobor is so important. They have to exactly establish the parameters where the bishops are going to be residing. Maybe one of the solutions will be the fact maybe the eparchies, they don't have to be so big. For example, in our church of Ukrainian Orthodoxy in Canada right now, we have 3 bishops. But this our church actually cannot be compared to one eparchy in Zachnia, Ukraine. So maybe the eparchies, they don't have to be so big. Maybe divided these cities into 3 or 4 small units where the bishop can reside. That's one of the solutions. This may be one caveat I want to add.
Anatoly, do you want to comment?
Yeah, maybe one comment. As far as I understood from that document, which was presented by Constantinople today, that from the point of view of Constantinople today, there is no jurisdiction in Ukraine. There are bishops, Orthodox bishops, and they must gather a council. There is no Orthodox Church of Kievan Patriarchate for them. There is no Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate for them because they cancelled those canonical act of 17th century. So for them, in Ukraine, this is a land with maybe 100 and something bishops, and all these bishops are canonical today. They all have their episcopal dignity, and they all must gather together and to decide how to move forward. As far as I understood from that document, that there is no church now, like a structure, like one structure in Ukraine. There are bishops.
So Filaret's position? He's just a bishop?
He is, as far as I understood, he is a metropolitan now.
Yeah.
But he was asked, "Are you a metropolitan?" By the journalist, and he answered, "No, I'm a patriarch." So it's very interesting.
And so, some of the parallels within ecclesiologies, when in the establishment of an exarchate, it means that you have a territory where very faithful and clergy live, but there's no formal structure yet, and that structure is still under the Omophorian under an exarch, and the two exarchs that have been appointed, and so formally the Ukrainian territories are now under the homophorion of the ecumenical patriarch, who has sent his delegates and has marked his territory with the cross. So there's a question in the back there. Yes.
I'm very glad this is taking place today after 11 o'clock, because up until now, since April, it was all hypothetical, so now we can talk about something concrete. And the question basically is, we heard a lot about the 16th and 17th centuries in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with religious pluralism. How far will the members of the panel or people here in the room tolerate free will of people and religious pluralism, a parallel jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine that doesn't fall under this motto of one одна помісна православна церква, and might not even be a patriarchate right away, so as not to follow the example of Russia with church and state relations. Would you care to comment on the possibility of multiple jurisdictions?
Okay. One of the solutions right now to the situation in Ukraine is the solution of the Estonian Orthodox Church. Maybe you heard that in Estonia right now there was also a problem with two jurisdictions, Moscow Patriarchate and also Constantinople Patriarchate. What happens? It is not an ideal situation, but it is one of the solutions. That in a specific country there are different jurisdictions, but it's only a temporary solution. So maybe that's exactly one of the solutions right now being applied to Ukraine. That in order to keep peace in Ukraine, maybe exactly the parallel jurisdictions, even in the same city of Moscow and Kyiv Patriarchate, maybe that's exactly what's going to happen. But I hope and pray that this last line will be quite important, and then won't be a bloodshed, and there will be peace in Ukraine, and the freedom of free will be preserved. That's what I can say.
No crystal ball, but and some of you know more because you deal with rural Ukraine. My guess is, in most areas of rural Ukraine, parishes will go one way or the other way. That is, we're going to see fewer divides in villages in which there, as we have seen around Pochayu, where the Moscow Patriarchate has tried to build churches when the villages go under Kiev Patriarchate. That is, villages will tend to act as units. They will probably, in most cases of central and western Ukraine, but not everywhere, go for the new church that is formed, with one major exception, which, and I regret that Professor Magochi is not here today. I think that we are going to see some very great finessing and action going on in Transcarpathia in order to keep that Moscow patriarchal eparchy together and find some way around things. I think we are going to find a great increase in Rusinism all of a sudden that's going to come out in Transcarpathia. Okay, and then I would guess in cities, one is going to have a pluralistic possibility, with the great change that in some areas of southern and eastern Ukraine, where the Kiev Patriarchate has been kept out of major areas, the new church will be able to act. So I would assume, I mean, they don't have terribly good places in Odessa right at the moment for the Kiev Patriarchate. So suddenly you're going to find that in center, above all, city administrations that were not giving these little pieces of property to build will now let them be built. And then the only other thing I would guess is the degree to which you have an oligarch's church in south and eastern Ukraine. That is, I would take it in much of south and eastern Ukraine, it's still your businesses and your moneyed groups that decide which way these churches are going to go. And that'll be interesting to see where they see. And I think if they see that Ukrainian government that when we talk about church and state, they are going to bend in what they see as their economic interests. So we'll see on that.
And I would just add, as we play armchair bishops here and trying to figure out what will happen, obviously there will exist these multiple jurisdictions in Ukraine, And in the same way that we have found abhorrent kind of a Russophilism or the philosophy of the Ruski Mir, the temptation should also be to resist the kind of a Ukrainian philitism that would be discriminatory of religious pluralism or ecclesial pluralism in Ukraine. And so it's one thing to talk about Ukraine as an entity and desire kind of this idealistic unified ecclesial structure. We can also look to the diaspora, where multiple ecclesial jurisdictions exist alongside each other, and those issues have still not been resolved. We have a Greek, a Russian, and Orthodox Ukrainian bishops all in the same city. These are all part of the same communion. And so these questions about the diaspora were brought up at the Pan-Orthodox Synod, and I think there's still more work to be done there, but also the question of how we recognize autocephalies outside this historical canonical territories. So, Father Jeffrey, yes.
Yes, thank you all. I think today was really eye-opening, and it has been a good cap to the events of today. So it was partly a question, partly an appeal in a way, and that is that in some ways this is a very Ukrainian issue, and we all laud and applaud, what's happening in terms of the Ukrainian nation and community and culture and so forth.
Father, can you speak up?
Sorry, yeah, just saying it's a Ukrainian issue on one level, but you said earlier about how this will play as a kind of worldwide Orthodox issue and so forth. My question is, for those of us who are minded to support and to work towards this unity in Ukraine and to welcome the Ecumenical Patriarchate's involvement, is what can we do? How can we be part of supporting this, being part of the solution and so forth, even on the local level here or working on the internet? God forbid if we should enter in these, trespass into these forums. There's obviously a whole propaganda war being fought. There's a whole, so you talked about the Russophile approach and so forth, but what role can we play, who aren't necessarily Ukrainian, who aren't necessarily part of the Church in Canada or in Ukraine, but in terms of bringing this to a kind of positive conclusion, hopefully not over decades, has been alluded to, but in a shorter time. And so it's because I think there is a kind of sense, I have anyway, that certainly the majority of people in my church, the Orthodox Church in America, would support this. There's a very carefully crafted statement of a couple of weeks ago that was saying, we want to remain in communion with everybody throughout, but what can we be doing to kind of bring the silent majority to bear to support Ukrainians so they don't feel like they're having to circle the wagons and be isolated through this process?
Does anyone want to comment? Question?
Okay. Father, thank you for the question. I would not say that it's only a Ukrainian question. Remember that the Orthodox at this moment is the family of Orthodox churches in the world. And if this issue pertains to an Ukrainian Orthodox church, one of the largest Orthodox churches in the world, it is not only an Ukrainian question. It's a question which at this moment is applied to the entire Orthodox in the world. One thing I hope that going to the second question, I hope that this kind of antagonism and this kind of bad feelings among the jurisdiction in North America will disappear. I hope that it is going to disappear and we know where they're coming from. Somehow, even after this event today, we can come together and discuss in a very fruitful way. That would be the beginning. And the second stage would be make exactly even the Sunday of Orthodoxy, where we can really involve the other, to this moment, only canonical churches will be also another step towards it. But I hope that there will be peace, understanding, and also that the recognition that it is done. Nobody can right now call the Ukrainians the schismatics or those samozvanci. Now the Ukrainian nation, the Ukrainians, we are recognized as canonical. And also I want to emphasize one thing. See, in one day, Patriarch Philaret was recognized as canonical. One day. It means only one thing. He was canonical all the time. It was only a formalization of the canonical status. That's the reason all of the baptisms, all of the sacraments are recognized as valid. All as valid. It was only the coming together to one table and the recognition of the church, of the state. That's my approach.
One just final comment. Good news, I came straight from a clergy association meeting in Toronto this afternoon. the clergy together, and this is a good sign, I think, in light of current events, have voted to make St. Volodymyr as the site of next year's Sunday of Orthodoxy. So if you accept, just there you go. There's
All right.
Maybe I just add on just to the one. I think it was already pointed out that these churches, the majority of bishops and people who join initially will be the Kiev Patriarchate and the Ukrainian Autocephaly Orthodox Church. We will see what happens with the Moscow Patriarchate. They have been under virtual blockade not only from the Vatican for context, but also from Orthodox communities abroad. When the Metropolitan of the Orthodox Church of America went to Ukraine, he had no contact with any of them. So you start from point zero at the moment. So anything is a tremendous step forward, that is. And if it gets done not necessarily through hierarchs, but through parishes, this would be a great step forward. And then I know a bit about the Orthodox Church of America in America, or at least in much of America. To this day, it doesn't really recognize Ukrainian ethnicity. That is, it has no parishes that are Ukrainian. Nowhere does it have a Ukrainian liturgy. And still has in some areas strong resistance to Ukrainian causes. This is now going into the past, and to the past with a generation that is gone. But I think the situation is going to be much harder in the U.S. for the OCA than it is in Canada, where the OCA recognizes that much of its constituency, particularly in Western Canada, is Ukrainian. They think of themselves as Ukrainian. There, it's easy to make ties. But what do you do with the parishes of Pennsylvania, where these parishes argue that they're more Russian than the Russians and don't want anything to do with Ukraine, and have sided heavily with Onufry and his church? So I think even within your church, I hope it goes well, but it's not going to be
working
easy.
on it.
Okay.
We had a question over here. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about this autonomy of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
Speak up, please.
The question of autonomy was brought up. First of all, apparently the Council in Crete dealt with this issue. My understanding is that this is really, as Dr. Sis was saying, kind of a cosmetic, if not fake thing. I've been told, and I haven't checked this, that if you look at the website of the Moscow Church, the Orthodox Church, all of its bishops there are just listed en masse, not as the Ukrainian bishops are not listed separately. They're just part of one church. And the second part of this question is, the Filaret said today that, and it's been said that the Russian church can exist, but just to be called the Russian Orthodox Church. Can anybody actually force it to, as far as registration goes, or whatever, to change its name as far as its status in Ukraine?
Panelists?
As far as I know that, I can answer the second part of your question. That as far as I know that the name of the church is a part of their statutes, statute. One representative of the state said that they will propose them to change that name in their statutes due to their canonical jurisdiction, because they are a part of Moscow Patriarchate. You can find in Ustav of Moscow Patriarchate that Ukrainian Orthodox Church is inseparable, or something like that, part of Moscow Patriarchate. So the government can ask them, okay, you are a part of them, please change your statute. And that's all.
Anybody else?
What was the question about autonomy?
Well, is it ecclesiologically, does an autonomous church exist in Orthodoxy? Apparently in Crete, it was addressed, this question in 20...
Yes. Is the question,
there
autonomous churches,
autonomy
or is the
versus
Church of Ukraine
autocephaly?
autonomous?
Are there autonomous churches in
Yes.
principle?
Yes.
There are. Yeah.
There are two differences. There's a difference between autonomy and
Finland.
autocephaly.
Yeah.
There's a big difference. Autonomy means you have a head of the church, but you still belong to somebody else. For example, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church before what took place just a couple of months ago, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine was the autonomous church with the Розширена автономія. That's exactly what it was called. Extended autonomy, thank you. But also this difference right now with the autocephaly. Autocephaly right now is a cell head that's a completely separate entity that governs itself. So exactly the discussion was about autocephaly, how to approach the subject of autocephaly. And once again, as I mentioned in my presentation, to this point, we don't have one canon which actually tells us how to do it. We have on the Mother Church of Constantinople that, very interestingly, footnote, so far, since in 19th century to the 20th century, all of the autocephalous churches were granted by Constantinople. All of them were recognized. But all of the autocephalous given by the Moscow Patriarchate, neither one was recognized as autocephalous. Neither one of them. It applies to what church? Sorry, Father, but OCA, Ortho Church of America. It applies to the Polish Orthodox Church, which was given the second of Cephaly in 1948, which applies to the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia, which also applies even to Georgia. What a paradox. Georgian Orthodox Church was established in the 4th century, Santa Mara, and was still subjected to the Moscow Patriarchate. Only in the last century received its own autocephaly. So this issue still has to be discussed and resolved in the future. But I have also another question actually I'm puzzled with. What will happen right now with the Ukrainian Catholic Church? There's a white elephant in the room. Question, what will happen right now with the Ukrainian Catholic Church? Is there going to be any change?
We won't give it a cardinal.
That's a different structure. The Roman Catholic Church has a completely different structure. But this question I'm posing because it's going to be, I'm sure it's going to be discussed among the members of the Ukrainian Catholic Church.
Okay. Well, that's a very good question because 2 of the 4 panelists are Ukrainian Catholics who have family members by marriage or biologically who are also Orthodox, come from Orthodox traditions. So there was a question over here. Yes.
Oh, that was a long time ago. My question is very practical. What happens with Počačka Laura?
So what happens with the Počačka Lavra?
Pečerska or Počaevska?
Yeah, Počačka.
So Pečerska Lavra is half government museum, the top, and half on this long-term contract with the Moscow Patriarchate. And my guess would be if ever there's a place where things are going to be dealt with rather carefully with the world watching, it's going to be in Kyiv. Someone else who knows more might about it. And that really, when you want to look for big conflict, it's going to be Počajev. Because Počajev, they brought in hundreds of rather suspicious monks and other such people into the monastery in Počajev. They put, unlike in Kyiv, where the Počačka Lavra, this Pavlov Metropolit, has considerable economic power, the Počajev Archimandrite basically controls the city of Počajev and the city government, right? And people's livings depend on the monastery, and yet around it is going to be a sea of people who want the change, and so once again, history is always good. We should go back and look at the Patriarch Mstislav's memoirs and what Počajev was like in 1934 when the Ukrainians rallied around to take it, because there I really think there is a danger if there's going to be a blow-up, it's going to be Počajev.
But, legally, there's a lease.
Legally there's a lease.
So, do you run out the lease, or do you
renegotiate? Yeah, you renegotiate the lease.
There's a contract, and if the government has enough will, they could actually look at how this lease has been handled. There's been a lot of rebuilding, a lot of all kinds of strange stuff going on in the Lavra, and they could probably find a lot of violations that perhaps, again, if there's the will to do it, and negate this contract.
Yeah. So there was a question here and then here. So here, yeah, please.
My question is more philosophical than has religion become too political? When one nation tells another nation how they should pray, in what language, when one nation tells us whether we can be autocephalous, And the decisions are made by politicians. All decisions religious are made by politicians always now.
Okay, so
Is it Christian philosophy that is failing? Or is it bishops or patriarchs or metropolitan?
So this is a good question. It's the role of the state or politics in affirming church autocephaly in Ukraine, and that would be kind of a more concrete example of today. And maybe some of the panelists want to comment on this. The role of the state. All of that.
Mr. Chairman.
What I would say is the reverse. What I have been amazed at is how strong the religious institutions have been. When you consider that Kravchuk in 1992 wanted to create an autocephalous church, it didn't work. Now you could argue Moscow could contradict that. In a strange way, although it may not be what I would prefer, I have been amazed at the tenacity of the Moscow patriarchal clergy's loyalty to Moscow. It has really been quite phenomenal in certain areas. I mean, we have seen numerous cases in which villages clearly want to join the Kiev Patriarchate. They have priests who are, now we can say there may be other reasons, family connections, financial, but there is a certain element of which has clearly been religious identification, and they have held out against it. So, and then just on a final one, and of course in Ukraine, Jose Casanova, who writes frequently on religious matters, always uses Ukraine because of this pluralism in Ukraine, which in a way has both given the churches a certain leverage and limits what the state can do. If you're not going to choose one church very clearly if you've got constituencies from other churches. So in a certain way, Ukraine is a better situation as a religious plural market in many of its areas. We will see what it will become now.
So we have a question here and then here.
If I may, a short comment. Well, some important words were worded here. Antagonism disappear. Antagonism will not disappear. The autocephaly has a social context. Yes, the social context is present, but most of all, the political context is present there, and the creation of autocephalous church in Ukraine, of course, is a dream and interest of Ukrainian people, but it is widely used for political matters. And in a way it is good because it happens now when the future autocephalous church becomes a strong tool for supporting the full independence of Ukraine as a sovereign state because of the war against Russia. So my comment is, let us not expect that it will happen quickly and seamlessly. Let us not expect that in Ukraine these churches and this part of churches will merge politely and peacefully, and that is why the question of that father, what we can do in order to help Ukraine to overcome this difficult period, is very right one. I don't have answer to this question, but of course the healing of these various how to say hatreds, etc. in religious field will be done quicker if the the war itself and the normalization in Ukrainian society comes quicker. So I would say it's dependent on the political and military situation in Ukraine. In the last moment, nobody will force Ukrainians, well, say, to switch from one church to another. Yes, of course, and it was stated very eloquently by the president of Ukraine today. You know, he made a long statement, maybe 3 times longer than the statement of the ecumenical patriarchate. But the logic of the strengthening of the state and nation will necessarily push more and more people towards this newly organized Ukrainian Autocephaly church. That's how we see it. Well, of course, there are different interpretation of today's law on religion, and there are flaws in this existing law, and this is another impediment to the normalcy of the process. But again, the political logic will prevail, and sorry to say, there will be a quick Thomas rather than a Thomas in a year or two, because of the as I feel it, because the level of interest of involvement of the society in the process is so high that every postponement would be understood as sort of betrayal or failure or something of that kind, especially taking into account that we have presidential elections in 6 months, and then we have parliamentary elections in next 6 months. So, as I understand, Thomas will be given in a month or two. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for your comments. Over here. Yes.
My name is Piotr Wróbel. I'm not Ukrainian. I'm completely lay. And now it's actually a follow-up to your question, because you are very excited, and to you this is something very emotional and very positive. But aren't you afraid that this is another challenge? That this will be very difficult? Does Ukraine need more challenges now? Will it really help? I am not sure about it, and maybe because I'm not Ukrainian, this is my approach. But don't you see this as a challenge, a difficult one?
Well, you gave the answer because you're not Ukrainian. Yeah. That's the answer. So the question is about whether this will be a challenge.
So what has happened since 2014 is the Putin government has weaponized the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. That is, if until that point, and particularly under the former head of the church, Metropolitan Volodymyr, the church tried to at least have some medium line between what might be called loyalty to the Moscow Patriarchate and the Ukrainian state. It crossed the line after 2014, not only in the occupied territories and in the Donbass, where you have the actual blessing of the weapons carrying them in their institutions, but especially in the person of Metropolitan Onufry, the refusal to stand up in the parliament to honor those who had died in the army, meant that by now you had a church that was somewhat confronting the state, but more important, this was going to increase. So the conflicts were going to come, and in that. Although the population had switched in its loyalty when you asked them, that is, tremendous growth in people who said, I'm a member of the Kiev Patriarchate. Of course, maybe I never go to church, but that's where I'm a member. That's the church I don't go to. So you had a huge shift in the population now to support the Kiev Patriarchate for patriotic reasons, for religious reasons, and for that constituency to which the recognition by the Orthodox Church was important. This caused tremendous problem and anguish even, including, as we saw in Ukraine, refusals to bury children who were baptized in the Kiev Patriarchate by the Moscow Patriarchate. So this had become a major social issue. So this issue then gives legitimacy to the Kiev Patriarchate. So for that, we don't know what percentage of the population. The polling of the Ukrainian population tells us that about 40% of the entire population of Ukraine says, I would belong to the Kiev Patriarchate, this is where I want to be. Now they have a church that's a legitimate Orthodox church, and they don't have to worry if their mother passes away in their flat, and the only church nearby is a Moscow Patriarchal church, that priest will refuse to bury their mother. So these are real social issues for people that had to be solved.
And this document will change this.
It's changed. It's done. It's all done now. And so what this is almost because by now the Constantinople Patriarchate has recognized these. The Moscow Patriarchate could now then break with Constantinople and become a sect in Ukraine. But by now, most people won't go along with it. So it solved a lot of very practical social problems. And although we don't have full statistics, our guess is about 16% of the Ukrainian population attends church regularly. That is on a Sunday basis. And of course, it's regionally different, much higher in Western Ukraine, in Volhynia and Zakarpattia. But compared to Western Europe, not compared to Poland, even with its declining religiosity, but compared to Western Europe, a very high percentage of the population is church attending in Ukraine or connected with the church. And so these were real problems. So this has been a tremendous step forward. And otherwise, the conflict would have continued. And the conflict would have gotten worse and worse as time went on, and Ukraine would have felt more and more isolated. And the other is, who could have considered the church in Greece didn't come out in favor of Moscow? I mean, given now, it has something to do with throwing out those Russian diplomats and a lot of other things, but this has now brought Ukraine now into relations with Romania, with Greece, with all of these, with Georgia, which will now improve tremendously. So this was really a very important step.
Well, I'm conscious of the time. I know there's a lot of questions, and we hope that you will continue to come out to these panels. I'm extremely pleased that we could collaborate with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, the Sheptytsky Institute, the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, and the Yatsyk program for the study of Ukraine. So thank you for all the representatives and the faculty and students who showed up from those areas. Thank you to all of our guests who showed up today. We're very grateful. This has been a tremendous turnout today. I think we had almost 60 people show up here. And will you please join me in thanking our roundtable panelists?